The wind howled through the empty streets of the small town, rattling old fences and tossing dust into the air. A storm was coming. Thick, dark clouds hung low over the rooftops, promising heavy rain. But inside a tiny backyard, hidden behind an old wooden house, something far more unusual was trapped in a doghouse. A girl. She was small, thin, and covered in strange silver-blue skin that shimmered slightly under the weak moonlight. Her large, glassy eyes stared at the sky, unblinking, as if waiting for something, or someone, to come and take her away. She had been here for days. The townspeople didn't know what she was. They found her in the woods, weak and barely breathing, her strange body covered in wounds. Instead of helping her, they locked her in this tiny space, treating her like an animal. She didn't speak their language. When she tried, all that came out were soft, strange sounds that no one understood. "She's not one of us," the people whispered. "She could be dangerous," others said. "She's just an animal. Keep her locked up." So they threw scraps of food near her and gave her water in an old metal bowl. She didn't belong to anyone, and no one cared what happened to her. Except for one man. Greg walked home late that night, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, his boots crunching against the gravel road. He was a mechanic, spending most of his days fixing cars in his small garage. He didn't get involved in town gossip. He didn't care much for rumors. But tonight, he had heard something that made his stomach turn. They got some kind of creature locked up in Billy's yard. A man at the diner had said, "Looks like a kid, but not a kid, you know." Another added. Greg hadn't spoken. He had simply finished his coffee, paid his bill, and left. But the words stayed in his mind, heavy like a weight on his chest. A creature. A kid, but not a kid. Greg wasn't the kind of man to ignore things that didn't sit right with him. And this didn't sit right at all. He changed his usual path home, taking a detour through the back roads until he reached Billy's house. It was an old place, the paint peeling, the fence barely standing. The backyard was dark, but Greg saw the small shape inside the doghouse, curled up like a frightened animal. His jaw tightened. She wasn't an animal. She was a child. And she was freezing. The wind grew stronger, pushing against the weak wooden walls of the doghouse. The girl hugged her knees to her chest, shivering as she listened to the sounds of the night. Her silver skin was covered in dirt. Her hair, a strange, soft white, clung to her face. She was hungry, tired, weak. Then footsteps. She flinched, pressing herself against the corner of the doghouse. A shadow moved outside. Someone was here. She braced for pain, for cruelty, for more whispers of, "Stay there, little monster." But the voice that came was different. "Hey, kid." Slow, careful, gentle. The girl lifted her head slightly, her large eyes staring at the man crouching near the doghouse. He wasn't like the others. His face was lined with concern, his brown eyes watching her with something she didn't recognize. Was it kindness? Greg sighed, running a hand through his short hair. Up close, she looked even worse than he expected. Too thin, too cold. And those eyes, not human, but filled with something very human. Fear. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small sandwich he had grabbed from the diner earlier. Slowly, he placed it near the entrance of the doghouse. The girl didn't move. "It's food," he said, voice low. "You need to eat." She stared at it, then at him. Was this a trick? Another cruel game? Greg didn't push. He just sat there, waiting. The wind howled again, carrying the scent of fresh rain. Then, cautiously, her small fingers reached forward, snatching the sandwich before pulling it close to her chest. She hesitated, then took a bite. Greg exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." The rain started falling, soft at first, then heavier. Greg stood up, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. He couldn't leave her like this. No one deserved to be left in the cold like an unwanted animal. He glanced at the locked gate, then at the quiet house. If Billy caught him, there'd be trouble. But Greg had never cared much for trouble. "All right, kid," he said, kneeling back down. "I'm gonna get you out of here." The girl stiffened, the sandwich half eaten in her hands. Greg carefully reached for the rusty lock on the gate, giving it a gentle tug. Locked. Of course. He took a deep breath and pulled harder. It snapped. The noise made the girl flinch, but Greg only nodded to himself. He looked at her again, holding out his hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you someplace warm." For a long moment, she didn't move. She just stared at him, eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, her small hand reached out, shaky, hesitant, until her fingers brushed against his. Greg felt the coldness of her skin. He tightened his grip gently. And together, they stepped out of the yard and into the storm. The cold rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking Greg's jacket as he led the girl away from the backyard. She walked behind him, her bare feet splashing in the mud, her thin body trembling. Greg could feel the coldness of her small hand in his, but she didn't pull away. That was a good sign. He didn't know what she was or where she came from. He didn't know why the town had locked her up instead of helping her. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to leave her out here to suffer. They had to move quickly. Billy was a heavy sleeper, but if someone else saw them, there'd be trouble. Greg glanced down at the girl. Her silver-blue skin glowed faintly under the streetlights, her strange white hair clinging to her face. She looked up at him, wide-eyed, silent. Greg sighed. He had no idea what he was doing. His house wasn't far. A small, worn-down place on the edge of town, where no one bothered him. By the time they reached the front porch, the girl was shivering badly, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Greg pushed open the door and led her inside. "All right, kid," he muttered, kicking off his wet boots. "You're safe now." The girl stood in the doorway, her eyes darting around the room. The house was simple. Just a couch, an old TV, a small kitchen, and a few scattered tools from his garage. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Greg turned to look at her. She was still soaked from the rain, her thin dress clinging to her tiny frame. "You're freezing," he said. "Hang on." He grabbed a clean towel from the closet and walked back over. When he held it out, she flinched, her body tensing. Greg hesitated. She thought he was going to hurt her. "It's okay," he said softly. "It's just a towel. Here." Carefully, he draped it over her shoulders. She didn't move at first, but then, slowly, she pulled it tighter around herself, as if afraid it would be taken away. Greg let out a small breath. "There we go," he said. "That's better, right?" She didn't answer. She just looked at him, studying his face like she was trying to figure him out. Greg didn't push her. He just went to the kitchen and started heating up some soup. A few minutes later, he set a bowl on the small table. "It's not much, but it's warm," he said, pulling out a chair. "You should eat." The girl approached the table cautiously, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. She sniffed the soup, then looked up at him, as if waiting for permission. Greg nodded. That was all she needed. She picked up the spoon awkwardly, like she wasn't used to it, and took a small sip. Her eyes widened slightly, and she took another, then another. Greg sat back, watching her. She wasn't just some lost animal. She was intelligent, scared, but smart, and someone had treated her like she was less than that. His fists clenched. The people in this town, they were afraid of anything different. That's why they had locked her up, why they had treated her like a stray dog instead of a person. Greg took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. "What's your name, kid?" he asked. The girl looked up from her bowl. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to understand. Then she made a soft sound, something like, "Nia." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Nia." She blinked, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Nia it is." For the next hour, Greg let her eat in peace. He brought her an old sweater and a pair of socks, way too big for her, but at least they were dry. She didn't talk much, but she watched him closely, her sharp eyes taking in everything he did. At one point, she pointed at his workbench, where a half-fixed radio sat among scattered tools. "You know what that is?" Greg asked. Nia didn't answer, but after a moment, she reached out and touched the broken radio. Her fingers traced the wires carefully, as if understanding them. Greg watched with interest. Most people wouldn't even know where to start with something like that. But Nia, there was something different about her. By the time the rain had stopped, she was curled up on the couch, wrapped in the oversized sweater, her silver blue skin finally warm again. Greg sat nearby, running a hand through his hair. Tomorrow, the town was going to realize she was missing. Billy would be angry. The others would start asking questions. He had a choice to make. If he kept her here, things could get dangerous. The town wouldn't like that. They might try to take her back. But if he let her go, where would she even go? Greg looked over at Nia. She was asleep now, breathing softly, curled up like she had never known safety before. Greg sighed. There really wasn't a choice at all. She was staying, and he would protect her, no matter what. The morning sun peeked through the curtains, casting soft golden light across the small house. Birds chirped outside, the world waking up slowly. But inside, Greg was already up, sipping his coffee at the kitchen table, deep in thought. On the couch, Nia still slept, wrapped up in the oversized sweater. Her silver blue skin had lost some of its sickly paleness, and for the first time, she didn't look afraid, just peaceful. Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had made his choice last night. He was going to protect her. But now came the hard part, figuring out what to do next. The sound of soft movement made him look up. Nia was stirring, her white hair messy from sleep. She sat up slowly, blinking at the morning light. Greg gave a small nod. "Morning, kid." Nia rubbed her eyes, looking around like she was trying to remember where she was. Then her gaze landed on him. She didn't flinch. That was progress. Greg stood and walked over to the kitchen. "You hungry?" Nia tilted her head slightly, watching him carefully. Greg grabbed a loaf of bread and pulled out a slice. He took a bite, then pointed to the rest of the loaf. "Food," he said. Nia hesitated. Then she pointed at the bread. "Food." Greg's eyebrows lifted. "Huh, that was fast." He handed her a slice, and she took it, chewing slowly. Greg sat back down, thinking. If she could learn a word that quickly, she was smarter than he thought. And if she was smart, that meant she had a better chance of surviving, if she had to. But she wouldn't have to. Not as long as he had anything to say about it. After breakfast, Greg decided to teach her a few more words. He picked up his coffee mug. "Cup." Nia frowned slightly, then touched the mug. "Cup." Greg pointed at the table. "Table." She tapped the surface. "Table." Greg chuckled. "Well, you learn fast." Nia blinked, then pointed at herself. "Nia." Greg nodded. "Yeah, Nia." Then she pointed at him. Greg hesitated for a second before answering. "Greg." Nia tilted her head, testing the sound. "Guh." Greg. Greg smirked. "Close enough." She gave a tiny nod, as if satisfied with the answer. And just like that, the first real wall between them began to break. The rest of the day passed quietly. Greg worked on a busted engine in the garage, while Nia sat nearby, watching closely. He could feel her eyes following every movement, studying every tool he used. At one point, he grabbed a wrench and turned to her. "This is a wrench." Nia reached out and touched it. "Wrench." "Yeah," Greg said. "It helps fix things." Nia stared at it for a long moment, then looked at the broken engine. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and ran her fingers along the damaged parts. Her silver blue skin shimmered slightly, and she frowned, as if deep in thought. Greg watched, intrigued. "What? You see something?" Nia tapped one of the metal pieces and made a soft clicking noise with her tongue. Greg leaned in. The part she touched was cracked, barely noticeable. His eyes widened. "How'd you?" Nia pointed at her eyes, then at the crack. Greg exhaled. "You can see the damage." She nodded once. Greg shook his head in amazement. "Well, ain't that something?" For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then, for the first time, Nia smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. And Greg felt something inside his chest tighten. This kid wasn't just special. She was something else entirely. That night, Greg sat on the couch, flipping through an old notebook. He had a lot of questions. Where had Nia come from? How did she end up here? And why did she know so much about machines without ever being taught? Nia sat across from him, hugging her knees, her glowing eyes watching him. Greg decided to try something. He pointed at the ceiling. "Sky." Nia looked up, then nodded. "Sky." Then Greg pointed at her. "Nia." She touched her chest. "Nia." Greg hesitated, then pointed at himself. "Human." Nia blinked. She tilted her head, thinking. Then, slowly, she pointed at herself. "Not human." Greg stared at her. That was the first time she had made a sentence. Not just repeating words. Not just copying. She understood. Greg let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he said finally. "You're not human." Nia looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers slightly. For a moment, she looked sad. Greg frowned. "Hey." She looked up. He tapped his chest. "Human." Then he pointed at her. "Nia." She hesitated. Greg nodded. "That's all that matters." Nia blinked. Then, slowly, she nodded back. And just like that, the last wall between them disappeared. The morning air was crisp, the sky clear after last night's rain. Greg stood outside his garage, wiping grease off his hands as he looked toward the quiet road. Normally, he wouldn't think much about the town's business, but today, something felt different. Too many people were out early. They weren't working. They weren't shopping. They were talking, whispering, watching. Greg's gut tightened. They know she's missing. Inside the house, Nia sat on the floor, flipping through an old car manual. Her silver-blue fingers traced the pictures of engines, her glowing eyes focused. Every now and then, she mumbled a word Greg had taught her, her voice soft but steady. She was getting better at speaking. Fast. Greg exhaled. That was good, but it also meant trouble. If the town found out she was here, he shook his head. He wasn't going to let that happen. But first, he needed to figure out what the town knew. At the diner, the usual morning crowd filled the seats. Farmers, mechanics, shop owners. Greg walked in, nodding at the waitress before heading to the counter. He didn't have to wait long before he heard what he came for. "You hear about Billy?" One man muttered to his friend. "Yeah," the other replied, voice low. "Says that thing's gone." Greg kept his face neutral, sipping his coffee. "You think someone took it?" the first man asked. "Don't know," the second man grunted. "Billy's mad, though. Said it couldn't have escaped on its own." Greg's fingers tightened around the cup. "Maybe it died out in the woods," another voice suggested. "Or maybe it's right under your nose," Greg thought. Billy himself stomped into the diner a few minutes later, his face red with anger. "I'm telling you, somebody took it." His loud voice silenced the other conversations. "You got proof?" one of the older men asked. Billy clenched his fists. That thing was locked up. It couldn't have left by itself. Someone broke the gate. Greg took another slow sip of coffee. Billy's eyes scanned the room. "If I find out who did it." Greg met his gaze without flinching. Billy held his stare for a second, then looked away. "Good. Let him wonder." Greg finished his coffee, tossed some bills on the counter, and walked out. It wouldn't be long before they started searching. He had to be ready. Back home, Nea was still reading when Greg walked in. She looked up, her glowing eyes sharp, sensing something was wrong. Greg didn't lie to her. "They're looking for you." Nea tilted her head. "Looking?" Greg nodded. "They know you're gone. They'll start searching soon." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she closed the book. Greg sat across from her. "I need to know something, Nea." She watched him carefully. Greg leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Where did you come from?" Nea hesitated. Then she placed a hand on her chest. "Ship." Greg frowned. "Ship." Nea pointed up. "Sky." Greg's breath caught. She wasn't just different. She wasn't just special. She wasn't from here. Greg ran a hand down his face. "You're telling me you came from space?" Nea nodded. Greg exhaled. "Well, that explains a lot." He wasn't sure what to think. Aliens weren't supposed to be real. But here she was, sitting in his house, learning his language, fixing his radio with just a glance. And the town had locked her in a doghouse. Greg's jaw tightened. "What happened to your ship?" he asked. Nea lowered her gaze. "Crash." Greg frowned. "You crashed here?" She nodded, gripping her sweater tightly. "Alone." Greg sighed. "And the town found you first." Nea nodded again. Greg leaned back. This changed everything. She wasn't just a lost child. She was stranded. And if she had crashed here, someone, something, might be looking for her. That night, Greg didn't sleep much. He sat by the window, watching the road, listening for anything unusual. The town would search soon. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And if they found her? Greg clenched his fists. He wasn't going to let that happen. Across the room, Nea watched him. "Greg." He looked over. She hesitated, then pointed at herself. "Bad?" Greg frowned. "What?" Her eyes were sad. "People think bad." Greg exhaled. He shook his head. "No, Nea. You're not bad." She looked at him carefully, as if searching for the truth in his words. Greg sighed and leaned forward. "Listen to me. Just 'cause people are afraid of something doesn't mean it's bad." Nea tilted her head. "Afraid?" Greg nodded. "Yeah. They don't understand you. And when people don't understand something, they try to control it. Or worse." Nea was silent. Greg tapped his chest. "But I understand." She blinked. "You're not bad," Greg said again. "You're just different." Nea's lips pressed together, and after a moment, she nodded. Greg ran a hand through his hair. "Get some rest, kid. Tomorrow, we figure out what to do next." Nea curled up on the couch, but Greg stayed awake. Because no matter what came next, whether it was the town or something far worse, he was going to protect her. No matter what. The morning was quiet. Too quiet. Greg stood on his front porch, sipping his coffee, watching the dirt road that led into town. Normally, people would be heading to work or tending their farms. But today, he saw something different. A group of men was walking together, their faces serious. They weren't here for friendly talk. They were searching. Greg's jaw tightened. Inside, Nea sat on the floor, playing with a few spare tools from his garage. She had learned their names quickly. Wrench, screwdriver, pliers. She held each one with delicate fingers, as if trying to understand how they worked. She was smart. Smarter than anyone in town would ever realize. And that's exactly why they feared her. Greg stepped inside and locked the door. Nea looked up. "Bad?" Greg hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, kid. Bad." The search party moved slowly. They checked old barns, backyards, abandoned buildings. Greg watched from his window as Billy talked to some of the men, waving his arms in frustration. "They're looking everywhere," Greg muttered. Nia sat beside him, watching carefully. Find me. Greg exhaled. Not if I can help it. She tilted her head. Hide. Greg nodded. For now. But he knew that hiding wasn't a long-term plan. They needed something better. The first knock came before noon. Greg opened the door to find Tom Harris, one of the older farmers. He was a quiet man, usually kept to himself, but today his eyes were sharp. Morning, Greg, Tom said. Morning, Greg replied, keeping his voice calm. Tom glanced behind Greg, as if trying to see inside. You hear about Billy's problem? Greg shrugged. Yeah, heard something went missing. Tom studied him. You see anything strange last night? Greg met his gaze. Nope. A long silence stretched between them. Greg didn't move, didn't blink. Tom exhaled. All right. He nodded once. If you do, let us know. Sure, Greg said. Tom turned and walked away. Greg closed the door, locking it again. Nia was standing in the hallway, her glowing eyes filled with questions. Man. Greg sighed. Checking. Looking. Nia frowned. Lying? Greg hesitated. Then finally he nodded. Yeah, kid. I lied. Nia thought for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she nodded too. She understood. By evening, the search had slowed, but Greg knew it wasn't over. The town wouldn't stop until they had an answer, which meant he needed a new plan. He sat at the table thinking. He couldn't just keep her hidden forever. Eventually, someone would get suspicious. But running, that was dangerous too. Nia sat across from him, quietly waiting. She trusted him, and Greg wasn't about to let her down. Finally, he spoke. Nia, your ship, where is it? She blinked, then pointed outside. Far. Greg leaned forward. Can you fix it? Nia frowned, thinking. Then she nodded slowly. Maybe. Greg rubbed his chin. Then that's our plan. Nia tilted her head. Plan. Greg tapped the table. We find your ship. We fix it. And we get you out of here. Nia's eyes widened. Then, slowly, she smiled. Greg nodded. Now all they had to do was figure out how. And they had to do it before the town found them first. The night was colder than usual. A soft wind whispered through the trees as Greg stood outside, staring at the dark road leading out of town. He had been thinking all day, trying to figure out how to get Nia to her ship without anyone noticing. Inside the house, Nia sat near the window, her silver-blue fingers tapping lightly on the wooden table. She had learned so much in such a short time. But learning wasn't enough now. They needed to move. Greg stepped back inside and locked the door. Nia looked at him, sensing his worry. Bad? She asked. Greg nodded. Yeah, kid. Real bad. Nia thought for a moment, then pointed toward the forest. Go. Greg sighed. Yeah, but not yet. Leaving in the middle of the night was risky. If someone saw them, it was over. He had to be smart. And for that, he needed a distraction. The next morning, Greg drove into town as usual. He parked his truck near the old general store, stepping out as if everything was normal. But his eyes were sharp, watching, listening. The townsfolk were still on edge. Groups of men stood together, whispering in hushed voices. Billy was among them, his face still red with frustration. Greg walked over to the store, pretending to check the notice board outside. He needed to hear what they were saying. Couldn't have just disappeared, Billy was muttering. Someone took it. One of the older men, Joe, shook his head. And what if it's still out there? What if it's hiding? Billy scowled. Then we find it. Another man spoke up. We should check the forest again. Greg's fingers tightened slightly. They were getting too close. Greg didn't stay in town long. He bought a few supplies, just enough to avoid suspicion, then drove back home, his mind working fast. By the time he returned, Nia was already waiting near the door. She could sense his urgency. "Go," she asked again. Greg knelt beside her. "Tonight," he said. "But first, we need to be careful." Nia nodded. She trusted him completely now. Greg grabbed an old bag and started packing. Food, tools, a flashlight. He didn't know how far they would have to walk, but he needed to be prepared. Then he turned to Nia. "We have to make sure they're looking the other way." She tilted her head. "How?" Greg smirked. "With a little fire." That night, Greg left Nia hidden inside the house while he drove toward the northern part of town. He parked near an old abandoned barn, the kind no one cared about anymore. Then, working fast, he set up a controlled fire. Nothing too dangerous. Just enough to create smoke, enough to make the town panic for a while. As the first flames flickered, Greg climbed back into his truck and drove home. By the time he arrived, the sky behind him was glowing faintly orange. In the distance, he could hear voices, people rushing to put out the fire. Perfect. Greg grabbed the bag and turned to Nia. "Now's our chance." She didn't hesitate. She pulled the sweater tighter around herself and followed him out the back door. And together, they disappeared into the forest. The woods were darker than Greg had expected. Tall trees loomed over them, their branches swaying in the night breeze. Nia moved quietly, her glowing eyes sharp, scanning the path ahead. Greg kept a steady pace beside her. "How far?" he asked. Nia pointed ahead. "Far, but close." Greg raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't make sense, kid." Nia frowned, thinking. "Close, but hidden." Greg nodded. That made more sense. If her ship had crashed, it wouldn't be out in the open. It would be somewhere deep, somewhere no one would stumble upon by accident. They walked for hours. The further they went, the quieter the world became. No distant voices, no headlights from town. Just them and the trees. And then Nia stopped. Greg frowned. "What is it?" Nia pointed ahead. "There." Greg followed her gaze, and his breath caught. Through the thick branches, he could see a strange metallic shape buried in the earth, half covered in dirt and moss. Its surface shimmered faintly under the moonlight. It wasn't from this world. It was her ship. Greg moved closer, running a hand over the metal surface. It was cold, smooth, unlike anything he had ever seen. Nia stepped beside him, her fingers tracing a pattern along the ship's surface. A soft hum filled the air. Then, slowly, a small panel opened. Greg stepped back. "That's not normal." Nia didn't seem surprised. She reached inside the panel, touching something. A faint glow spread across the ship's surface. Greg watched in awe. "Can you fix it?" Nia hesitated, then nodded. "Need time." Greg exhaled. "All right, kid. Then we better hurry." Because if the town found them here, it would all be over. The ship hummed softly in the dark. Faint blue lights flickered along its smooth metal surface as Nia pressed her fingers against the control panel. Greg stood behind her, gripping his flashlight, scanning the trees around them. They didn't have much time. The fire in town had bought them a few hours, but soon, people would realize Greg was missing. And if anyone followed his tracks into the forest, they'd find this. Greg clenched his jaw. "How long will it take, kid?" Nia didn't answer right away. Her glowing eyes flickered as she studied the ship's systems. Then she whispered, "Not good." Greg felt a pit form in his stomach. "What do you mean, not good?" Nia hesitated, then placed a hand on her chest. "Ship hurt." Greg sighed. "Yeah, I figured that. Can you fix it?" Nia nodded slowly. "Need power." Greg frowned. "Power, like a battery." She shook her head. "Big power. Strong." Greg exhaled sharply. That was a problem. This ship wasn't some old truck he could jumpstart. Whatever energy it needed, he sure didn't have it lying around in his garage. but there was one place in town that might. And it was the last place Greg wanted to go. The power station on the edge of town wasn't big, just a small plant that supplied electricity to the farms and shops. Greg had worked there years ago, back when he needed the money. He knew it inside and out, and he knew how to steal power from it. Greg turned to Nia. "All right, kid. Stay here. I'll be back." Nia's eyes widened. "Alone?" Greg nodded. "I have to. If they see you, it's over." She looked down, gripping her sweater. "Danger?" Greg forced a smile. "Nothing I can't handle." Nia didn't look convinced, but she trusted him. She nodded. Greg turned and started running back toward town. By the time he reached the power station, the town was already waking up. He could see flashlights in the distance, people still searching for clues about the fire. Greg kept to the shadows. He knew the layout well, the fuse boxes, the generators, the emergency circuits. All he needed was one strong battery. Slipping through the back door, Greg moved fast. His fingers worked quickly, pulling loose a heavy power cell from one of the older units. It was big, but it would have to do. He hoisted it onto his shoulder and turned to leave. Then he froze. Outside, voices were getting closer. Greg cursed under his breath. No way out the back. He scanned the room and spotted an old ventilation shaft near the ceiling. It was small, but it was his only option. Greg climbed up, gritting his teeth as he pulled the heavy battery with him. He barely squeezed through before the door swung open below. Billy's voice echoed in the room. "You sure you saw something?" Another man muttered. "Could have sworn I heard movement." Greg held his breath. Billy's boots stomped around for a moment, then he cursed. "Damn rats. Let's keep moving." The door slammed shut. Greg exhaled. Too close. By the time he made it back to the crash site, dawn was creeping over the horizon. Nia was waiting. When she saw him, her eyes lit up. "Greg." Greg dropped the battery onto the ground. "I got what you needed, kid." Nia knelt beside the power cell, running her fingers over it. A faint blue light shimmered from her touch. Then the ship reacted. A deep hum spread through the air as the metal came to life. The control panel lit up, and the ground trembled slightly beneath them. Greg took a step back. "Is it working?" Nia smiled. "Yes." Greg couldn't help but grin. "All right, then let's get you home." But before Nia could respond, a gunshot rang through the air. Greg spun around. Billy stood at the edge of the trees, his shotgun raised. Behind him, 4 other men from the town stared in shock at the glowing ship. Billy's face twisted with rage. "I knew it. You've been hiding that thing this whole time." Greg stepped in front of Nia, his hands clenched. "She's not a thing, Billy." Billy's finger hovered over the trigger. "You got 5 seconds to move." Greg didn't move. Behind him, Nia touched the ship. A soft vibration ran through the air. She whispered something in her strange language, and suddenly, the ship responded. A bright pulse of energy rippled outward, knocking Billy and his men backward. Their guns clattered to the ground as they groaned in pain. Greg staggered back, shielding his eyes. When he looked up again, Nia was floating. Her silver-blue skin glowed in the morning light. The ship's hatch opened, and a soft voice echoed from within. Nia turned to Greg. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she spoke. "Come." Greg's chest tightened. He looked at the town behind him, the people who never understood him, who never accepted anything different. Then he looked at Nia, a girl from another world, who trusted him, who saw him as more than just another man in a small town. Greg made his choice. He stepped forward. Nia smiled and reached out her hand. Greg took it. The ship's hatch closed behind them, and with a final hum, the craft lifted off. The men on the ground could only watch as Greg and Nia disappeared into the sky. Epilogue. A new journey. Far beyond Earth's atmosphere, Greg sat beside Nia in the ship's control room. Stars stretched endlessly in every direction. He let out a breath. "Well, kid, where to next?" Nia smiled, and together they set course for the great unknown.